Hi again, welcome back. Let's do a little bit more for an introduction on the 12 cranial nerves. I sort of skimmed through them in an earlier lecture. I hope to skim through them again with a little bit more detail on all 12, and then again when we're done with the 12, we will go back and focus on 5 and 7, on the trigeminal and the facial. So, cranial nerve number 1, you remember that it is sensory only. The old corny anatomy joke is that it's the only nerve in the body that smells. So, the cranial opening, I'm going to be asking you to remember for all 12. And these are the olfactory foramina in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. So if I showed you a picture of the cribriform plate and the ethmoid bone, sort of on the floor of the cranium as we did earlier in the quarter with bones, I'd expect you to still be able to identify those openings through which the cranial nerves pass. So, it's shown here in the diagram. Here are the olfactory nerves, and they are innervating the olfactory epithelium, which is the region of epithelium in the nasal cavity that has the smell receptors, the olfactory receptors. It's relatively small in humans. In dogs and bears and other animals, it's quite large. So one other thing to sort of note when we're going through these slides, I picked these slides just because they show the olfactory nerves pretty well, but they also show a lot of other detail. And we're going to be revisiting the same slide talking about other nerves. So it's not a bad idea just to spend a little bit of time looking at the illustration, reading the labels. So, down at the bottom left are the olfactory nerves, but then there are the palatine nerves, the greater and the lesser. And there's a little reminder that they are part of V2. So if you can start paying attention to that, you start repeating this information more and more, and then you start to learn it and remember it better. So also there is the pterygopalatine ganglion that we've talked about. And there is the maxillary nerve. That's V2. Note that it says sphenopalatine foramen dissected away. Okay, whatever. You remember where the sphenopalatine foramen was for right now. What else is on here? Well, there's your greater petrosal nerve. And that was carrying fibers from which cranial nerve and which parasympathetic pathway. So, if you just sort of spend a little bit of time looking at these figures and the labels and trying to make connections, you'll do well. Studying anatomy this way or any other way just takes a lot of time. There's a lot of structures to try to remember. Okay, next slide. I think that's all I wanted to do with this one. Next slide is the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2. Again, it is sensory only. You remember how many cranial nerves are sensory only? 1, 2, and 8. And so this is all sensory. It's going back toward the brain. So it enters the cranium through the optic canal. And then the point of crossing over is the optic chiasma. So from the left eye and the right eye, they cross, and that's the chiasma, the crossing over. and then those optic tracts run back to the occipital lobe of the brain. Notice also that they're starting to show some other detail. Here is the ophthalmic nerve, V1, passing through the SOF. So you should be able to tell me what other nerves pass through the SOF. Again, just reviewing and trying to make connections. Okay, let's move on. Then we have the oculomotor nerve, which we've talked about some. It is motor only. And here's what we have going on. It has both somatic motor and parasympathetic motor. Okay, we just finished talking about the parasympathetic motor of 3. So again, it passes through the SOF. And the somatic efferent. So efferent is motor. So these are somatic motor fibers. To 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles. Now I'm not going to ask you to remember which 4 of the 6, but I would expect you to remember that there are 6 extrinsic muscles, and they're sort of organized something like this. If this is the eyeball, something like that, and let's say this person has green eyes. Okay. We have a red pupil instead of a black pupil. But the muscles, and if this is superior and this is medial, just for orientation, these are fibers that run off the superior portion of the eye. There are fibers that insert on the inferior margin. There are fibers that insert on the lateral and the medial. And then there are fibers that run sort of obliquely, and they run off this direction. Let me go back. On that one, there's a little pulley there. And on the other side, so there are the 6 extrinsic muscles of the eye. I've drawn the muscles sort of splayed out horizontally on a blank screen, but you need to appreciate that they all run from the eye back to the apex of the orbit. And we had the superior rectus, SR, superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, and lateral rectus. And we had the superior obliques, SO, and the inferior oblique. Those are the 4 extrinsic muscles of the eye. 4 of those 6 muscles are innervated by the oculomotor nerve. And since those are skeletal muscles, they're voluntary. That's part of that somatic motor division. You practice drawing the flow chart with all the little boxes. The parasympathetic fibers going to the intrinsic muscles of the eye. We were talking about the pupillary constrictor muscles, but this is the parasympathetic motor, efferent motor again, to the intrinsic eye muscles. And there's a ciliary body for focusing the lens, and then the pupillary constrictor muscles. And they synapse, as you recall, in the ciliary ganglion. And then a question just to think about, how would the patient's eye look if they had damage to the oculomotor? say one side of the skull was affected. Well, that eye is not going to be behaving the same as the other eye. It may be going wonky, not tracking the same. It may not be responding to light the same because there's a problem with the olfactory nerve. Okay, let's go on. Cochlear nerve, not a lot to say about it. Motor only. And it also exits the cranium through the SOF. This is 4. And it goes to the superior oblique, which is drawn here. This is the one that had fibers going off in this direction and then running through this pulley and then going back toward the apex. I am not likely to ask you to remember that the trochlear nerve, number 4, innervates the superior oblique. If I did, it would be extra credit. I don't know if I'll do that or not. So, it's on the slide, but this would probably be extra credit. So whether or not it's worth memorizing that on top of everything else you have to do, you can decide. I'm not requiring it. Next slide is the trigeminal. And we will come back to this. There's a lot more that we want to talk about because this is the one that's innervating the teeth. And this is both sensory and motor. So there are motor fibers and sensory fibers within the nerve. So the largest of the cranial nerves has a sensory root and a smaller motor root. So on the sensory, 3 subdivisions, V1, 2, and 3. So we have to innervate all of the teeth and different dermatomes of the skin. So this is a picture of the dermatomes. So these are areas of the skin. So, everything sort of in this area is more or less being innervated by V3. The mandibular portion. The upper portion, more or less like this, is being innervated by V2, the maxillary portion. This is the idea of the dermatome. And then we have the other region, more or less like that, which is V1. So remember, these are sensory. So if you are working on the upper jaw, the cheek, the palate, those sensory fibers from that area are going to be carried by V2. If you're working on the tongue, mandible, lower gingiva, those sensory fibers would be carried by V3. And then we have already talked about the muscles of mastication. And you know how these branches pass through the skull. So you just have to go back and review that. And you do. If you do, it'll come back to you, and the next time you have to review it, you'll remember it. So I think I have another slide on the trigeminal. Yeah, so just a different view. Here is the ganglion. and it just shows the three branches, the ophthalmic branch to the SOF, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. Okay? So remember that the trigeminal ganglion, this is all sensory. Now, a word on ganglion, ganglia for plural. How do we let me go to another slide here. So let's define ganglia. It's the plural of ganglion, which is singular. But ganglia are defined as a collection of cell bodies. Outside of the CNS. Okay. So, for example, let's just pick a ganglia at random. Let's say, I don't know, let's pick the pterygo, no, that's too long to spell. Let's just pick the ciliary ganglion. You remember what it looked like, what it's involved with. It was a parasympathetic pathway, and it involved fibers of cranial nerve 3, went to the ciliary ganglion, and then that went off to the eye, right? But here's the ganglion. And the cell bodies are part of the postganglionic fiber. So that fits our definition. And there's more than one. You know, I've just drawn this ganglion, this ciliary ganglion with a single synapse, but there are hundreds of synapses in the ganglion. So there are lots of these cell bodies. You know, there's more than just one neuron going off to the constrictor muscles. There are numerous neurons. So we have a collection of cell bodies. That's what causes a swelling. Okay? So we have a synapse here, but in the trigeminal ganglion, we are dealing with branches of V1, V2, and V3, right? And they're all coming together. And we have this big ganglion here. And then we have the trigeminal nerve. So this is V5. That's the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 5. And off on the left are branches of 5. Well, this is the ganglion. And you know that V1 and V2 are, well, let's just review this. Talking about the trigeminal ganglion anyway, said, let me back up a slide. 2 slides. Larger root is sensory. Smaller root is motor. Okay. So most of this is sensory. There's a smaller portion here which is motor. what kind of motor is being carried in V3? Parasympathetic, sympathetic, or somatic? Those are our three choices. Well, we had no parasympathetic in V3, so this is somatic motor. Going, of course, to muscles of mastication. Okay, back to the early basics review. How many neurons are involved in this pathway? In any somatic motor pathway? Yeah, 1. So my question to you is that in this trigeminal ganglion, are there any green cell bodies? No, because it's a one neuron pathway. So the cell body is way back over here somewhere that we're not worried about. That's off in the brainstem. Okay, so back to the trigeminal ganglion. These are all black sensory, right? Coming from the teeth, coming from the dermatomes of the face. How many neurons in all sensory pathways? 1 neuron again. So what's going on in the ganglion? Well, the sensory neurons look sort of something like this. They don't look like this multipolar one that we have over here. The sensory pathways, or neurons, look sort of something like this. You probably remember this from A&P. And there is a cell body. It's 1 neuron. We have sort of a peripheral portion and a central portion, but that's a single neuron. And the action potentials are going in this direction. And it's those cell bodies that are in the trigeminal ganglion. Okay, let's go on. Was I done with the facial? I think so. Oops, dang, where am I? Hang on a second. Okay. So that's what's in that trigeminal ganglion. So if I just drew one here, sort of in red, it might look sort of something like this. Here comes one of those sensory neurons, comes down, there's a cell body, and then it continues on. Again, it's all 1 neuron. Okay, I think that makes sense. So, the abducens, number 6, and we'll stop this lecture here because I'm going to divide the 12 into 2 groups of 6. So this is the abducens, number 6. Remember, it's another one that's motor only. Goes through the SOF. So remember all of those that run through the SOF. And it's somatic motor to the lateral rectus, extrinsic eye. So again, this portion would be extra credit if I were to ask for it. Okay? I still expect you to know that it innervates one of the 6 extrinsic muscles. So taking a look at this figure, can you, what else can you identify on this? As you're trying to wrap your head around anatomy from a series of slides. Well, I'll just highlight some things that pop into my mind, and I'll just label them, and you can figure out what they are, maybe. You know, what's that big cavity? What's this cavity? What is this guy? And, you know, I better, let's go to red maybe. Can you identify those two branches? And can you ID the opening? And can you ID the opening here? That's probably enough. Well, you now know what this is, right? A big swelling. And you know what to call this. Okay. I believe that was it. Yeah. We will stop here, and the next lecture I'll run through the remaining 6 in sort of this level of detail. So, see you soon. Bye.